The North American Leaders Summit is coming to an end. During his visit to Mexico City, President Biden met with Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The three leaders discussed a range of issues, including migration, clean energy, and trade. The trilateral meeting is held most years, although there was a hiatus while Donald Trump was president. For more on this meeting, CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang joins us now from Mexico City. Weijia, what can you tell us about the meetings that have taken place between these leaders so far and what we expect to hear from them in just a few minutes in this joint statement?
Well, Nancy, I do think there will be some news whenever Canada and the U.S. announces that Canada has agreed to purchase a U.S. defense system for Ukraine and that President Biden will make his first trip to Canada since taking office sometime in March. We also expect the three leaders to talk about all those things that you just mentioned because they had a very lengthy meetings all day. The president also met separately with his Mexican counterpart as well as Prime Minister Trudeau. And so they will be talking about agreements that they have come to when it comes to working together on migration, on economic competitiveness. For example, they have decided to have a forum on semiconductors because, of course, one reason that they want to come together is to show North American solidarity as well as competitiveness against China, which has been the source of semiconductors for so long. So, Nancy, there is a lot to get to here today. And I have to say, with regard to the meeting between President Biden and President López Obrador last night, it set a bit of a tense backdrop because President López Obrador said essentially that he wants the U.S. to be doing more, that the president has a key in his hand to better the lives of people in Latin America as well as the Caribbean, without asking for more new investments in dollars. So we'll have to see if they came to any commitments to that. But there certainly is a lot to get to. As you can see behind me, there are three podiums. We are waiting for the three leaders. I just saw Secretary of Homeland Security Mayorkas here. So things are getting underway. They're running a bit late, but we do expect them to come out momentarily.
Weijia, you referenced that rocky start that this meeting got off to yesterday with some really pointed comments from the Mexican president who's hosting this summit. Right. He said that the U.S. needs to end its attitude of abandonment of Latin America and its disdain for Latin Americans. President Biden clearly felt the need to clear things up, and he said, well, actually, the U.S. has spent tens of billions of dollars on aid to Latin America over the past 15 years. But what are you hearing from White House officials behind the scenes about why the Mexican president felt he needed to say that in this setting and how they feel about it?
Well, I think given the current climate right now, there's a lot of finger pointing, given the crisis at the southern border, given stigmas that are attached. And actually, one of the things that the three leaders decided on was to curb xenophobia and to help with the discrimination against people from this region. And so I think that, he wanted to be very firm. He is the host of this summit. This is his country. And so one thing, though, that I am interested to find out more about, Nancy, is, that exchange happened in front of the cameras. It happened in front of reporters. So you can only imagine the tension that might have unfolded as these two leaders met in private. Again, it's not necessarily surprising because unlike other relationships that President Biden has, it's not exactly a warm one with President López Obrador, who was very supportive of former President Trump and who actually ditched the America Summit that President Biden hosted in Los Angeles over the summer. And so there's already tension there, and I think that set the stage for even more. But these two countries need each other. They have to work together, and so they will put on a united front when they address the press in just a moment.
So the format for this press conference we're waiting for, and correct me if I'm wrong, Weijia, is that each of the leaders, the three leaders, will speak, and then they'll each take one question or a question from one reporter, rather, from each of their home countries. So they're not exactly going to be subjecting themselves to a raft of questions from the reporters who are gathered there. But has President Biden or have White House officials there in Mexico faced any questions yet or responded to any questions yet from reporters about this situation having to do with the classified documents that were found at the Penn Biden Center here in Washington, D.C., we now know discovered about 2 months ago?
Right. You are right about the format. That means one American journalist will be able to ask questions of President Biden and perhaps the other two leaders as well. And no, he has not responded to, the story that our colleagues broke last night about these classified documents in the Penn Biden Center. And there's no doubt that he will have to. It's just a matter of when, especially given what he has said in the past about the classified documents found at the former president's resort down in Florida. Now, to be clear, these are two very different situations. However, we are still talking about classified documents in both instances. And so, at the time, he was vice president who could not declassify documents. We still don't know exactly how they made their way to his private office. And we don't know, and I think this is important, Nancy, we don't know whether ODNI, the Office of National Intelligence, has already launched or is planning to launch a risk assessment of those documents and what it could mean for national security. So I think the White House, we got their statement in terms of what they are saying. It is very much, that they are working with the National Archives, making the point as often as they can that the president's lawyers self-reported that as soon as they discovered these documents, they decided to turn them in. They didn't have to be asked about this. There was no conflict. And so even though they're not elaborating, again, Nancy, I fully expect an American journalist to ask the president about that when he takes a question.
Well, that'll be interesting to watch, and I'm sure we'll talk to you again after that. Weijia Jiang, thank you so much.